would like to do is, of course, I cannot do justice to the more than 2,500 years of history of very serious Buddhist thinking in this domain. But at the same time, I thought I could give a little bit of glimpse of the kind of questions the Buddhist thinkers were, struggling with, and the kind of the amount of thought Buddhist thinkers have given to this quite early, from a very, very early stage. Before I begin, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that listening to both Michelle and Arthur, to your presentation of quantum mechanics as well as special theory of relativity, and the challenges posed by the kind of the new physics. In fact, the challenges it poses to our very conception of what constitutes matter, our very conception of what is a matter and what is not a matter, which is so dominated by our everyday language of objects, things, and properties and attributes, and the kind of the paradoxes it leads to, as His Holiness very, kind of pointedly, shared with us. And this is something that has been very acutely felt in the Buddhist world as well. Among the Buddhist classical thinkers, there were four main schools which came to be categorized. And except for the Madhyamaka school, which is the middle way school, most of the other Buddhist schools really felt the need to, in order to have a coherent worldview, a theory of both matter and the mind, there needs to be a kind of a reductionist approach made to really reduce from the macroscopic level of everyday experience, to tease it out, divide it up, to look at its constitutive elements, go down another level, tease them out, unpack it, go down another level, unpack it, tease it out, so that ultimately you can get to a kind of a starting point. It's a bit like what Descartes was trying to do. It's a foundationalist. And then these, but again, the Madhyamakas pointed out that kind of project is actually quite unhelpful. So you can see that the tensions that we are witnessing in the world of modern physics is a tension that has been felt in the Buddhist world quite early. So what I will do is, I will give a very, very brief background for the benefit of scientists and scholars here, those who are unfamiliar with the history of Buddhist thinking. Much of these theory of matter and consciousness really begin to emerge, the systematic theory, in the early kind of Abhidharma texts. And here, of course, the dating, there is some dispute among the modern scholars. But the earliest one that we know is Abhidharma Hridaya, which is really attributed to somewhere around 1st century before the Common Era. Now, and this is the text where we begin to really see the explicit usage of the term dul, atom and particles. So as I said before, it's a reductionist approach. It's ultimately is a search for ultimate constituents of reality, from the gross level going down to smaller and smaller and smaller at different levels of reality. It ended up creating a pluralistic taxonomy of real entities. It's known as Dharma theory in the Buddhist studies jargon. And it ended up taking an atomistic theory of matter. So, and then the constitutive elements of these are, these are kind of the simple indivisibles, partless particles. And they ended up with a list of 8. 4 great elements and 4 derivative elements. Now, the derivative elements includes some of the properties which in Western thought would be regarded as secondary properties on Galileo's list. Sound is not there. Touch and order and so forth. Sound was excluded because sound was really thought to have no ability to propagate its continuum, because it rides on wave, and wave, does not continue. Wave is just one pushes the other, and sound therefore cannot propagate in a kind of a continued fashion. Then the list of the elementary particles, they made a distinction between, what is called Zedul Tarab. So these are really the ultimate constitutive elements, and which, for want of a better word, I've translated as elementary particles. This is the smallest unit. And then atom is really thought to be a composite of those smallest units, at least 8 of these. And then molecule is kind of 7 of these composite atoms. So that was the kind of the unit that they built up. And then there was a very sophisticated, complex list of how the aggregation takes place, how it gets grosser and grosser and grosser. It's a very, very complex explanation. The main point is that the elementary particles are ultimate indivisible. So this is really the final end. So you cannot go beyond. And now, then the question is, when within this atom there are 8 of these elementary particles, then the question was, how are they relating to each other? They were thought to be not touching each other, but then the question is, how is it they don't disintegrate? It's held by air. So there was, that was the, in very, very crude terms, summary of the early Buddhist Abhidhamma theory of atom. We could see a more sophisticated take on this, called what we might call a Sautrantika revision. Sautrantika is another school. They maintained the reductionist approach, but they rejected the plurality of entities. They wanted a much cleaner, efficient system. So they defined reality, or ngopo, in terms of causal efficacy. And they came up with a simpler taxonomy. So basically 3 classes of phenomena: matter, mental, and their attributes. And then they came up with this idea of degrees of reality. So they made the distinction between substantial reality versus real in name and concept only, so which are constructs. So substantial realities are entities whose identity, in order to conceptualize, does not require the conceptualization of something else. So whereas those that are real in name and concept only, like person, the notion of a person is the second category, because notion of a person, in order to have it, it presupposes a notion of mind and some bases which are not person. Then they also maintained they retained these ultimate irreducible elements: indivisible particles, partless particles, and indivisible time. So with relation to matter, the way in which it was divided up was according to the indivisible atomic process, and ultimately getting to the indivisible particles. And for consciousness and mental processes, it was divided up from the grosser level of conscious experience that you can report, down to going ever more subtle levels where you can divide up the duration, time, into eventually identifying an indivisible point of time. So you can see the sophistication of the thinking behind all of this. And compared to the other Abhidhamma school, Sautrantika had a slightly different take on how the particles within an atom relate to each other. So they accepted they do not touch each other, but at the same time, they said there are no spaces in between them. So that was how they maintained. Now here, you can see that this is a Buddhist essentialist school, and although their approach is reductionist, one thing that I have to clarify to the Western scientists and scholars here is that when I talk of Buddhist reductionist school, none of the Buddhists ever can be characterized as a reductionist in the Western sense, where you reduce even the mental to the physical. No Buddhist schools ever did that. Other than that, Buddhists would have a reductionist process for the mental world and reductionist process for the physical world. But the mental is never reduced to the physical. So that's an important caveat